Greetings, dear listeners. This week, Christine and Sam are joined by Laura Field, a political theorist and the author of the new book, Furious Minds, The Making of the MAGA New Right. It's a sharp, readable taxonomy of the thinkers, factions, and subcultures that helped build the MAGA coalition, from the Claremont world and national conservatism to post-liberal Catholicism to harder-edged online currents. In the conversation, Laura describes how she came to study the New Right, beginning with her training in Straussian political philosophy and her reaction to the Flight 93 election essay, and why she concluded that the movement was not going to fade after January 6th. They examine how these ideas move from theory into power, shaping debates over economics, immigration, and the future direction of the Republican Party. The episode closes on a bigger question: why liberalism, after decades of assuming its own inevitability, has become so vulnerable. With both domestic and foreign policy in complete uproar these days, it's a very timely conversation. Before we get started, a reminder to head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and consider becoming a paying subscriber if you're not one yet. And don't forget to give us a like and review on your favorite podcast app. With all that out of the way, on to the show.
Our guest is Laura Field. We're very excited. She's the author of Furious Minds, which came out earlier this fall, and is a fascinating sort of taxonomy of, the making of the MAGA New Right and all the different players. But yeah, Laura, tell us why now? Why this?
Who are you, Laura?
Yeah.
Sure. I'll tell you a little bit about myself, you guys. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really, really happy to be here talking with you both. So I am a political theorist by training, and we can go into this as much detail as we want, but I'm a Straussian, or was a Straussian. I'm sort of heretical of the Straussian school of political philosophy, which is basically...
Can I ask a clarifying question? If you start as a Straussian, can you ever not be a Straussian?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I would say I'm a Straussian based on the sort of hermeneutical principles of reading, but I'm a bad Straussian in that I don't obsess about Strauss. I don't read a ton of Strauss and never have. I like the kind of primary texts more. And a lot of the Straussian world sort of leans conservative, though it's very complicated. And there are these different schools of Straussianism. I'm not very loyal to any of them. And I'm just not very invested in any of that. But I did find myself writing about it in this book more than I ever would have expected, sort of re-engaged with these old questions of Straussian political philosophy. I tried to limit it quite a bit. I mean, there was more in there that I had to take out because it's just not of that much general interest. But so my editors told me. But anyway, I was trained in this school of thought, which for me just meant, it meant that I was a convert to great books. And as an undergraduate, I had these amazing professors at the University of Alberta who were really powerful teachers. I mean, a lot of Straussians are known for just being excellent teachers. And they kind of introduced me to the tradition of political philosophy in kind of a canonical sense, right? Like the Plato, Rousseau, Nietzsche, Hobbes, Locke, just the sort of grand narratives and to really close reading and to understanding these books as literature and philosophy. And so I really loved that. I took a turn in my life toward, away from what I was planning to do. And I just kind of became really committed to this and sort of conservative curious for a while. But I've never really called myself a conservative or voted for conservatives. But I went to do my PhD in political philosophy at the University of Texas. And I guess long story short, I finished there. I wrote my dissertation, and then I graduated in 2011. And in 2016, when Trump won the election, I was sort of scandalized by that. But I was pretty shocked to read that Flight 93 election essay that Michael Anton published pseudonymously in the Claremont Review of Books, because that was kind of adjacent to my world, right? I was not a West Coast Straussian, and I always sort of knew about the Claremontsters, and I had applied to grad school at the Claremont Graduate University, and I had friends who went there. So it was just like, wow, that's really surprising to me. I'm going to start watching this more closely. And so I that was in 2017. So I started writing about this stuff because then the sort of movement started to form. So Patrick Deneen's book came out, which was so important, Why Liberalism Failed. And then they started forming then the national conservatism movement started coming out. And I was sort of looking to do more public facing writing anyway. So I started writing about these guys. I thought that they would leave the scene. I did not think I would be writing a book about them. But in 2022, I wanted to write short version. In 2022, I saw clearly that was not the case. I thought they'd take the off-ramp after January 6th. They didn't. Some of them sort of tried, but, it wasn't really happening. So Trump was back on the scene. They continued to consolidate power in the GOP. And so I pitched a book about it, wrote the book. The book became more and more important, and surprisingly, I was surprised when J.D. Vance won the nomination, or was given the nomination for the vice presidency, or however that works, when he was chosen, I guess. And I was, surprised when they won, surprised by Elon Musk and Doge. I continue to be surprised. So, now things are kind of starting to get complicated for some of these people. But anyway, so that was why I wrote the book.
Yeah, that's the element of surprise has dogged all of us since 2016. I think I feel the same way that you did. Like at each point, you're like, surely not. And then, in fact, yes. And then, sure, no, really? This time? I think I met you, Laura, for the first time kind of in the midst of this at, gosh, what? I don't even remember.
I think it was
what
Patrick
year
Deneen's
it
book
was.
launch.
Yeah, Patrick Deneen's book launch.
I think I met you after. I wrote to you after, and then we've met at a few other places since then. Because I loved the way I just loved your presence on that panel. It was a really interesting panel but now it's even more interesting, right? You go, it's like Kevin Roberts, wasn't it? And J.D. Vance and Patrick Deneen. And then Christine Emba, just sounding entirely reasonable and unflappable.
It was, it's a funny thing. Somebody sent me this because now we all get our information filtered through AI if you use Google. And apparently if you Google like leading post-liberals, it pulls from pictures too and that event. And so Google tells people that I'm a leading post-liberal thinker along with Kevin Roberts and J.D. Vance.
That's wonderful.
And it's like, I would like to correct that assumption, but
but there are the post-liberals in England who seem quite a bit more sensible. Like there's all these different varietals, right? So you don't identify with any of it, Christine?
Different varietals. I would say that I identify with an interest. I was going to say an interest in the common good, which is something that we should get into later. But these questions of, the representation of I guess that the average citizen, I do think that there's an element of sort of the government and our systems working, against the benefit of the average and everyday person. And I do think that there is a particular level of autonomy and sort of market fetishization that has become very corrosive to our society. And so in that sense, like if that is what liberalism has come to represent in this moment, which in some senses maybe it is, but and this is a question I have for you later, then yeah. But I would not say I'm on J.D. Vance level here.
No, I see. I'm with you on that, I think. With most, like with where I would put, I'm very sympathetic to a lot of those arguments.
So jump into the kind of force the argument a little bit. So when you think, like, there's like one historical thing, which is like, okay, there's some people that were involved in these debates. What's the substance of the arguments? And then where do you see it as like actually forcefully, substantively shaping the practical reality of our politics now?
So, I think it's useful to think of the Gipperstuhl and Reagan and sort of what this movement stands against when they do present themselves in kind of an analytic form. And so you've got the old establishment conservatism standing for free trade economics, social conservatism, and sort of anti-communism, but that sort of turns into liberal internationalism. And then Michael Anton famously said that or famously, I'm trying to make it famous. He said, defined Trumpism in that 2016 essay as economic nationalism, right? America first foreign policy and secure borders. And I think it still included the social conservatism. And so I think on the economic front, there has been a lot of interesting stuff happening with the new right? I mean, from the post-liberals in particular, and then some of these policy guys like Orrin Cass and the reindustrialization stuff. And in a way, I mean, I think my book maybe doesn't do enough about that because I didn't take it very seriously. And I don't take it I take it seriously theoretically. But I'm not an economist, and I'm sympathetic to a lot of those arguments. And I think they shaped the Biden administration quite a bit, right? Because Trump took a lot of that stuff on the tariffs and then the reindustrialization, all of that stuff I think got taken pretty seriously.
Jake Sullivan.
Yeah. So I think that stuff is is certainly worth thinking about. I don't know that we want the versions that the actual post-liberals have promoted, or I don't think that my sense is that their economic policy maybe isn't up to par or isn't what it needs to be, but I don't really know. And so, but I think that economic stuff, not economic nationalism as like with the tariffs and everything, I don't actually want to take a stand on this stuff, but I find it very interesting. And I just don't know really enough about economics to fully flesh that out or take a stance on it. And I think it's been impactful. I mean, obviously, too, on the international affairs front and just like the foreign policy and the immigration policy. I mean, it's been, look around us, right? I mean, that stuff. I mean, I don't think it's mattering for the numbers as much as they want to, right? And it seems extremely cruel and perverse. And I am extremely horrified and disgusted by that. So I can't really speak reasonably about a lot of it. But I think that really has mattered. And that has to do with these guys that I've been writing about.
How is that? Like, trace the through line a little bit. So you start with kind of arguments. Well, yeah, what are the arguments? So is it like theocratic arguments about the role of religion in public life that you're thinking about? Is it nationalist arguments about how you define the borders of a political community? What are some of the like salient ideas that you feel like end up like kicking into, say, the immigration thing you were just describing?
Well, I mean, there's this great piece by Greg Sargent that was just out. It's focused on Stephen Miller, right? But it really goes through how the immigration policy is basically becoming white supremacist. That the current Trump administration's policy is sort of white supremacist in practice. So they're, getting rid of all kinds of asylum seeking, limiting it, except for white Afrikaners. I mean, this is really insane. And so the birthright citizenship stuff, just the deportations of not criminals, but people who, have built lives here and who are, anyway. So there's so much is happening on the immigration front. And it's rooted in, if you go and read that Flight 93 essay, it's basically great replacement theory. I mean, we didn't call it that back then. And I think the argument is there are a bunch of strains of it, but one of it is that, Michael Anton basically argued that the Democratic Party is importing people to win elections. So that's the conspiracism. I think that, and it's racially inflected. He really went off on Muslims. And so, or I guess that's, ethnically or religiously based. But big part of the argument that you see now with Miller and with other people in the administration. And Michael Anton is basically the author of this new security, national security survey. I can't remember exactly what it's called. So I think like the idea that it matters is not just me projecting, right? But I think the argument here is that people from specific cultures with a kind of Anglo-Saxon or just like Western Europe who share some of the basic assumptions of liberal democracy going back historically, right? That America has typically had, that only people who share that that cultural background are fit for life in a free society, right? And I think you can understand how that's a plausible argument. Like you can understand how that on some ideational plane, it could be true, or you could see it being true that people have to be sort of brought up in a free society to live and flourish in a free society. The idea that that's actually true of sort of people coming to this country, that only people who come from societies that look like ours or have similar historical backgrounds are fit to be here, it just seems I think untrue on the face of it. And So they're angling kind of against multiculturalism. I mean, this is a very diverse country, right? Going back to the beginning.
It's kind of the whole point. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they've built this sort of intellectual frame to make these arguments that are extremely exclusionary. And if you look at sort of immigration policy of the last century, which is one reason that Greg's piece is so good, it was basically as of 1924, an ethnically exclusive policy, and then the 1964 Immigration Act changed that, right? Right around the time of civil rights transformation, they changed that so that it was not based on those same basically racial preferences. And now these current guys, I mean, especially the Claremont guys, I don't think the post-liberals are nearly as dedicated to this. They don't seem it to me, though J.D. Vance is perfectly happy to go along with it, right? But the nationalists and the Claremont people, I think, are quite devoted to this idea that since 1964, immigration has been a huge problem for the country and needs to be reversed.
So we'll link Greg Sargent's piece. It's at the New Republic in the show notes. But I want to step back a little bit from this. I mean, I kind of viewed Furious Minds as being sort of a really thorough taxonomy almost of sort of all of these characters that make up the new right, the post-liberal movement, and yeah, I guess everything that goes into MAGA right
a catalog
now.
of wonders.
Yeah. Yes. Wonders.
It's been called a bestiary. I like catalog of wonders better.
Yeah, maybe wonders, Darag. But could you talk a little bit about the difference, I guess? I mean, you mentioned here that, they're sort of like the Claremonters or the Claremonsters who do seem very interested in sort of this racialized conception. And then, the post-liberals might not be like so interested in this, though they're okay getting behind it. And then, I mean, I was particularly fascinated in the book when you started talking about just sort of like the weird masculinist new right. But like, what are you go through sort of like a group of almost, you go through like almost 10, maybe more than 10 different segments, but how are you chunking out how these segments are affecting policy or like being represented in this administration or in this moment? Some definitely seem to have fallen off a little bit. Some are still on the rise. Michael Anton is just right there still with Stephen Miller.
Though I think he's actually left the administration or is about to.
Yeah, he's about to.
But yeah, I mean, it's tricky to kind of I can go through the different groups and I think it's worth sort of thinking about how they are different and some of the schisms. But I think when it comes to policy, it's sort of idiosyncratic because partly the book's just not about the policy very much. I mean, it's about policy ideas in the kind of abstract sense, but it's not about Project 2025, right? So and then to try to untangle how it's impacting things is sort of, know what I mean? It's tricky, but I can talk about the different things that
I guess
it matters.
Maybe the question is, all of these different segments have sort of slightly to very different ideals or like focal points. And some of those have kind of fallen away. But then some of them, like sort of this racialized concept of the nation, have like really stuck around.
And it's also, I mean, also like, as you're talking, it's interesting because like you're talking about like senior important figures in the administration, but we're not talking about Trump himself, like largely. It seems like his approach is sort of aloof from, kind of holds this coalition together, but it's not obvious that they have like significant direct influence, like through JD maybe, but like
JD maybe.
Maybe. And like the question I think there is like, so there, it seems like there are two practical questions there. One is just like, is this forcefully actually all shifting or shaping things behind the scenes? And I mean, Stephen Miller seems like an obvious like counterexample or like primary example of that happening. And then I think the second place where it seems to be important potentially is based upon what happens for succession. So like if like whatever after Trump, what happens to that party seems to be tied to this in some kind of fashion, how these debates turn out. But
Mhm.
I was just going to say, I mean, so my read is that the the situation with this administration seems much more to me like a European style parliamentary coalition than like the US usually has. Usually we end up developing like a fairly homogenous party platform within one party
Mhm.
before the election, and then that
Mhm.
sort of rolls out. I think Harris ran like that kind of campaign essentially. This
Yeah.
side, I mean the Republican side, I think seems very, very different than that in this case. So you
Yeah.
have like an interesting uneasy alliance with maybe some of the people that you're writing about, like the whatever, the theocrat side, the immigration hawk side, the industrial policy people like an American Compass, but you also
Yeah.
have like very different. I mean, you have like the like Barstool or Joe Rogan kind of people. You have, and then I think my read is the current like oldest sibling within the coalition is like Silicon Valley New Right, that like
Yeah. Yeah.
really are exerting like significant force downward, and like some of them like Teal seem to tinker with some of the ideas that you're talking about, but in large part, it seems like they're actually driven by wildly different kinds of
Yeah.
priorities,
No,
and
that's
how they
useful.
at any point like start like actually coming into alignment or disalignment with this seems to me to be interesting, and they're like really interesting like friction points in some of those places.
There are. I mean, that's okay. So my basic take is that, I mean, I think I think that everything you guys have both just said, and we'll just sort of have to come back and keep probing this, because I think all of that's right. There's all these different contingents. There's all these different sort of factions on the right. I think that's right. It's this messy coalition. We're starting to see how messy it is now, like almost 1 year into things, right?
Just
And
as like one concrete thing there. I mean, it's really hard for me to imagine Patrick Deneen and Mark Andreessen agreeing about
But
like any.
have I got the piece for you, Sam?
Okay,
Because there's
exciting.
this article
That's
that Patrick
exciting.
Deneen wrote in Unheard at the beginning of the year, where he's trying to square the circle. I mean, let me say a little bit more, and then we'll come back to that. Okay, you bring me back.
Great. This is exciting.
Yeah, I want to link
Okay.
that.
Okay, yeah, we'll link that. Okay, so my basic take is there are these interesting schisms. I have, as we've noted, so much is so surprising that it's just very dynamic to see what's happening. In the book, I sort of differentiate mainly the post-liberals as sort of different from the rest of the crowd here, who I think the Claremonters are basically they're traditionally against the administrative state, right? And they've been a very powerful voice. And like when you hear Bannon say, "Let's destroy the administrative state," that's kind of a Claremont line. Like they've got a lot of scholarship on that. The Claremont people never really accepted the New Deal and have been going on attack mode, for like decades now. It really did prepare the ground. You can read about how they helped with the Tea Party and, just all kinds of stuff. So they're sort of, I mean, in addition to all of the immigration stuff and the sort of, one of the things I was surprised by is there's this kind of paleo-conservative dimension to the Claremont people now, and I think it's kind of been.
Can you define that quickly? Yeah, what is like? How do
well,
you see
they
that?
used to. I mean, the Claremont people are inspired by Harry Jaffa, who's a big Lincoln scholar and basically a declarationist. So very focused, very like supportive of the Declaration of Independence and the especially the equality in the Declaration of Independence. He wrote this whole book about. I mean, he's written tons. But he really emphasizes Lincoln's sort of moral insight into equality and how it's incompatible with slavery. I mean, this is not that sort of news to us, but he did a wonderful book.
Yeah, we're pro-equality here. Yeah.
Pardon?
We're pro-equality here. Yeah.
Yeah. So
it seems like it should be
pro-equality
straightforward.
here, but he sort of revealed it's a very weird book, but he wrote this book on the Lincoln-Douglas debates where he really drove this home with like a Straussian hammer. Okay, so this stuff about Lincoln. The current Claremont people are, as when I say they're kind of corrupted by paleoconservatism, it means they're sort of hearkening back to the old right, and which is sort of more nativist, particularist. Paleoconservatism stands against neoconservatism with sort of its international globalist dimensions, including some of the. I think the paleoconservatives have also been accused of anti-Semitism. So if we're talking about and certainly racism, okay, because Pat Buchanan and Sam Francis became paleoconservatives and were also sort of ousted from mainstream conservatism because of that. So I was surprised in my research that the Claremonters, or some of these guys, especially Michael Anton, have been sort of immersed in paleoconservative thinking. But basically they're anti-statist, small, limited government, conservatives. That's who have this deep attachment to the American founding. That's the Claremont group. And the nationalists are, that's sort of the NatCons, National Conservatives, led by Yoram Hazony, and they're committed to the principle of nationalism, that then sort of an old-fashioned nationalism with like a capital N. They want a unified nation state, and they think that a world of unified nation states, and nation states can be diverse amongst, there can be diversity between nation states, but not really within an ideal nation state. So it kind of takes on this ethnic flavor. Yoram Hazony defends this idea that a true sort of nation state needs to be relatively homogenous with respect to language, culture, religion. He doesn't quite say ethnicity, and I don't think he believes about I don't think he's a racist either necessarily, but what are you trying to say about America if you're trying to impose that onto the country? So they're kind of the nationalists of the what are we calling it? Catalog of wonders. And then there are the post-liberals sort of stand apart because they have a different, they're statist, right? They're quite comfortable with the large state in a way, or some of them are. And they would define themselves, I think, as being oriented towards the common good because of this critique that they level against liberalism, which stands for individual autonomy, and the kind of disintegration in their mind of community bonds, family life, and all the traditional things that weave our culture together and our society. And I think, that's where you get, I'm kind of sympathetic to the idea that that's how liberalism has played out in a lot of ways, though I think they vastly exaggerate it. Anyway, so they're quite different. They're not so small government. They are much more sort of morally oriented towards what they call the common good. And that, I think, is where some of these interesting policy ideas are coming from, though I don't think the American Compass people are necessarily Catholic, right? So that's kind of coming from different quarters. But I think that, so the most interesting thing to me are some of these economic ideas, where they're challenging neoliberalism, thinking about different ways to, focusing on human flourishing, and also just this idea that I'm sympathetic with that you find in some of the earliest writings in that Journal of American Greatness that's part of my book, which is sort of this
It's a great title.
Flight 93 election on secret blog. And what they're talking about is basically like neoliberal orthodoxy basically puts economics ahead of human flourishing and ahead of politics. And they're saying, no, politics needs to take command of economics. And sort of, I think of this in Aristotelian terms, like politics as the architectonic art. If you're a serious statesman or politician, you get to make decisions about what's good in the economy, and your decisions about the economy should be oriented by and informed by knowledge and thought and like ideas about human flourishing and what's good for people. And so I think the post-liberals they're in agreement with what I just said, right? And a lot of the people argue on the new right will argue in terms like that that it's time to kind of rethink the economy. And I'm sympathetic to a lot of that stuff.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So can we, I'd like to pull back from, so it seems like there are, that's a really helpful overview and summary. And I think, there are a lot of these instances where in these kinds of conversations, it's like, hey, let's just roll through a kind of analysis of like what people we disagree with think, and then that's useful. Whereas I think for me, like what I am intrigued by in the work that you put together, and I think the broader conversation, is the force of the question, actually. So it seems to me that, like, if I read the political cycle of the last, couple of decades, there is a large contingent in this country that doesn't necessarily map directly to party. Like, I think that there's it's probably dominant on the left, or sort of, this is a centrist view, basically, and like it transcends both sides. But it's sort of, hey, we've pretty much figured out what the paradigm should be. That post-war consensus like works. We know how to build liberalism. This is like, the sort of stereotype of Fukuyama. Like we got it. We understand and this is also how Rawls worked. Like, hey, we understand
Yeah.
what justice is. That's great. Now we just need to implement it.
Mhm.
And that rippled out in how we thought about economy. It rippled out in how we thought about international affairs. It rippled out in what it meant to be patriotic. It rippled out in ideals of equality. And because there was like, okay, we know what the answer is, the ability to like actually just keep inquiring about the world or looking and
Mhm.
trying to understand whether that prior actually maps the nature of the world, I think
Mhm.
atrophied in a lot of that demographic. And so then
Yeah, I
it-
totally agree.
and so then I think what's happened is that for internal reasons to that tradition, like Alistair McIntyre writes about how much like we think within traditions, but also traditions can break. And when they break, that's the moment when you have to be able to think about or interrogate an alternative, or you're searching for alternatives. And I guess the way that I've seen like essentially like the political cycle, I don't know, since the new millennium or something, you had this series of things that broke. And it's like, oh, what is that? Why did it break? How did this operate? And that centrist part of the coalition tried to just hang with that and
Mhm.
say, okay, like we know the answers still, and the people who are critiquing it are just basically wrong in some kind of way.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of that contingent still doesn't know how to ask that question, actually, like even after this long period. Like
Yeah.
there's a significant, and so then the people that you're writing about, I think 10 years earlier or something, did start think, or maybe like much earlier than that, did start thinking and trying to say, okay, like what is this center? How did this work? Why don't we agree with the idea that we actually answered all the meaning based questions of life? And then their attempt to push at this is like from one angle and are trying to hit at it. But I think like if you understand that frame, there are a lot of other factions that have also had the same misgivings. So I think a lot of the Black Lives Matter movement actually had exactly the same sense, that it was like a minoritarian opinion within um, U.S. public life that was like, wait, we don't agree with the primary social contract that's developed the society,
Mhm.
and we need to kind of figure out how to interact with it in a very different kind of fashion. I think a
Mhm.
lot of the like the Bernie or DSA crowd is very similar, where they're like,
Yeah.
we actually don't agree that the meaning of life and everything was solved for us in like 1948,
Yeah.
and a lot of the things that have happened since then actually play out a paradigm that we have some pretty fundamental misgivings about. So I guess like I'm interested in, I mean, I guess this is my normal job at Wisdom of Crowds, is just to like press people to be constructive instead of
Yeah.
just diagnostic. But I do think like my own sense is that that's a real question. Like the question of like what it means to build a just society is not an easy one. And it seems to me that a lot of what's surfacing in all of this is like a boiling feeling like, wait, we actually didn't, whatever that previous consensus was, it had so much force and power to it
Hmm.
that it meant that people who didn't agree with it felt totally displaced by it. And so then it's like, okay, what should we do instead? And the people you're writing about are one manifestation of that sensibility. But it feels to me like that question is a very salient one. Christine, I don't know, you might have like a really different read of that period and have a different orientation to that, but that's my own kind of reflection after reading the book.
Yeah, well, one of the questions that I was kind of going to press on in the book too, and maybe it's adjacent to what you're saying, Sam, is that you talk about, you give us this taxonomy of these different players um, in the MAGA scene and the different places they come from, whether it's Claremont, whether it's Israel, whether it's anywhere else, but as much as they sort of attempt to ground their theory in, you know, books or literature, or readings of the classics, or Jaffa or, anything else. To me, it really, what you what you make pretty clear in the book, or what seemed pretty clear to me, is that they are actually animated by deeper forces often that,
Mhm.
are, I you can justify being kind of a blood and soil racist by saying, no, it's nationalism, which you define like using these scholars from this time. Or, you can talk about sort of principles of virtue and, like heroes from ancient Greece, but what actually they're really interested in is like masculinity, and this particular like gender essentialism, or like ethno-nationalism, or
Yeah, no, I mean,
anti-Semitism, all sort of like what are the real forces behind sort of all of this, I guess, intellectualizing in
Yeah, I
the
mean,
new
I
right
think
right
that
now?
sort of captures the okay. I mean, I think that in a way, Christine, you're pointing to something that is certainly there in the book, because I didn't want to just elevate what they're doing when I think so much of it is grounded in those sort of, I'll just call them like the dark forces of politics,
Yeah,
right?
and I mean, maybe some of them
But I
are
think a
not
lot of
totally
that,
dark, like religion is one of them, like, oh, we really want to
no,
talk about morality. Um,
no, and exactly. I mean, I think that the truth is that maybe there's a bit of. I mean, one thing we haven't talked about is the other faction, which I call the hard right, which is sort of the really nasty stuff, right? The
Yeah.
fascism, the real misogyny, and like explicit violent rhetoric. But I think that what I was also trying to do,
I mean,
and so
that's
that's in there.
that's an interesting question. Just quickly, I mean, so like, Heritage right now is getting ripped apart by these debates around Nick Fuentes,
Yeah.
and the question I think there is that the same lineage that we're talking about here, or is there actually like a kind of complicated? So like one of the things I was watching is that one of their principal Catholic board members, Robbie George,
Yeah.
resigned over
Yeah.
specifically the alliance, okay, it's complicated, right? Heritage is in favor of Tucker, and then Tucker interviewed Fuentes, and then that
Defended
sort of
the
kicked back
interview,
into
yeah.
like the yeah.
Yeah.
And so like inside that institution, and I think it's a sign for a lot of the current coalition dynamic, there is this crazy debate playing out, right? Like where
Yeah.
are the lines and how are they working? But it is interesting that in that case, one of the principal forces that was against the Fuentes wing is also Catholic. Not in this new right
Yeah.
contingent exactly, but still there's like competing
And
conviction.
I think he's probably friends with some of the Catholics that I write about.
I'm
so
sure he is.
They're. I mean, I was really glad to see that. I mean, in terms of just the politics here, I'm not especially sympathetic to the brouhaha, because I feel like it's way too little, too late. But that's not to say. But I'm really glad that it's happening. That there are these conflicts emerging, and that some people are having issues with it, and it's okay if it takes people a while to sort of to believe it, right? I think a lot of people didn't really believe how bad it was, and so it's good that Robbie George is making a statement. And I mean, I also in the book, I mean, a lot of this stuff is pretty ugly. I mean, I think that's pretty obvious by now, right? That there's
Yeah.
this sort of there are these racial elements, there's bigotry, there's the anti-Semitism that they pretended this whole time was just a problem on the left. So that and they've welcomed a lot of that in. Like I think that's one thing my book tries to show, is that there has been this radicalization, there's been this breaking down of boundaries. I mean, I could give a bunch of examples, but I do think that that's not just what's going on, right? That's not the full story. And I was trying to show in the book how, not just why some of this stuff is alluring and seductive, and not just because it's sort of an intellectual veneer. I mean, there's intellectual veneers everywhere, right? And everything in politics is not to say it's all high and low mixed together, that we're all just like a jumble of drives, because I don't think that's quite right. And of course, we can disentangle, right, the people who are motivated by principle and who act on principle, and people who are consistent, right? And then people who appear to be using these intellectual arguments as a kind of lie, right, about what they want to do, and sort of to dress things up in a kind of in a way that is that distorts things, that distorts the truth. And so there are examples of both of these things in the book. But I think that maybe to get to, I think partly what Sam is saying, and I think Christine, I think you're saying a bit about this too. I was trying to show that they're exploiting real vulnerabilities of liberalism, right? And that there's sort of, as you say, there's these, it's not just, I think you're right, Sam, that these vulnerabilities and there's a lot to be angry about. There's a lot to be disappointed about. The establishment, I think, by the time Trump won the second election, I was always like, oh, I get it. Like, I get this. I am also like, I was not tempted to vote for Trump, but like,
Yeah.
I was not that happy
you didn't
with
want-
my vote. And if it had been Biden still in there, I would have had a very hard time of it. I was really mad. But so I think that there is this.
I mean, this is like, you don't want Larry Summers you don't want like him to be the second round of like this.
It's nothing personal. I mean, Larry Summers has his own problem now, right? He's got his own problems.
He does have his own problems.
Yeah.
Yes, that's correct.
But I mean, no, it's just like the kind of stagnant, like smug, delusional way in which these establishment people operate, and just the fact that he didn't stick by his I think first election promise to only be a one-term president. I mean, and the lies that went into sort of protecting him, and the fact that he never spoke to the public. I mean, all of these things. I exaggerate a little bit, but not much, right? And so I think that. I guess my point is, I think that even if I'm not sympathetic to much of where this is going, they're talking about theoretical. They're exploiting theoretical vulnerabilities of liberalism and the fact that it's kind of been dormant. Nobody's had to talk about anything sort of important about the economy or about what it means to be a liberal, what the meaning of life is, what's good for human beings. Like, everybody's completely illiterate on these questions as far as I mean, I'm totally exaggerating. There are all kinds of people who are good at this and who do this important work, including you both. But just sort of in terms, I try to talk quite a bit about higher ed in the book because that's one of the threads I'm interested in. And that's a place where I am frustrated. I mean, I'm frustrated by my own experiences in higher education. And I love academics and I love the work people do. I'm not like anti-CRT. It's not that. It's just these systemic problems, the failures of administrations to protect the, liberal education. I mean, I could go on and on. So I think there are these important different clusters of people who are seeing this. And there's a huge amount of dynamism, and I'm very hopeful, but there were some real vulnerabilities there.
Yeah, this was one of the most exciting parts of the book for me, like near the end, where you make really plain your frustration with this. I mean, it's always very annoying when people like read from your own book to you. But
oh no, I'm happy to have someone else read it.
Yeah, but you talk about basically why liberalism has become so vulnerable to these forces, and partly as a result of that history, liberals have for far too long accepted a minimalist self-understanding that avoids all talk of virtue and ethical vision. They've similarly refused to acknowledge and cultivate the moral worlds and traditions that sustain our lives. And you say, this is understandable, but it's time to do better, to step up, have a bit of ambition, and admit that liberalism could be something wonderful, and in truth, it already is. Like, I'm really compelled by this idea, and it's something that we talk about on Wisdom of Crowds a lot, that there's this assumption that like liberalism should be self-evident. Liberalism has its own like value system, but no one actually talks about what it is or is sort of like able to defend it. Or, it is very possible to make strong moral and ethical cases. It is important to talk about like what a vision of human flourishing looks like, or what a vision of a good society looks like. It is compelling to have a positive vision of something that you're promoting, if you want to be elected, if you want to be in government. And liberalism seems to have has either lost it, or has lost its ability to explain it, or is too shy to like take a stance on any moral or ethical question.
I mean, I think it's tricky for liberals because those visions can never be just one thing, right? And those visions have to be pluralistic. And so we all get kind of tongue-tied when it comes to, or I do, but I'm not a liberal theorist, right? But I think it becomes hard to kind of sort through the subtleties of this, because as a liberal, you don't want to impose your own like comprehensive worldview, but you also recognize that liberal democracy has a kind of moral core, right? It has a sort of some moral basics that go along with it that you should be able to articulate. And and strive for, right? Liberal ideals. And
what are those
like
to
Lincoln
you?
was very good at this.
Yeah.
Well, can I read? I'll read a passage, okay? I
Yeah.
mean, just to get off easy, I'm going to read this passage from Lincoln
love it.
because it's my
Yes.
favorite. But I mean, and then we can go from there. But okay, so this is from Lincoln's speech about the Dred Scott decision, right? This infamous decision that declared that Black people were not constitutionally protected and were not constitutional equals or racial equals to white people, right? This horrible decision. And so Lincoln gave a speech about this where he gets at the meaning of the Declaration and says that you know that Justice Taney was wrong, right? That the Declaration was meant to be a universal declaration of equality, and he says. So he says the founders did define this kind of equality with tolerable distinctness with respect to what they in what respects they did consider all men created equal. They were, he explained, equal with respect to certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then he said that the Declaration was intended by the founders to be a beacon of hope for a more equal future. Okay, and this is a passage I'll read directly. This is Lincoln. They meant simply to declare the right of equality, right? So that the enforcement of it might follow as fast as circumstances should permit. They meant to set up a standard maxim for free society, which should be familiar to all, constantly looked to, constantly labored for, and even though never perfectly attained, constantly approximated, and thereby constantly spreading and deepening its influence and augmenting the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors, everywhere. I mean, so that's this kind of just like an aspirational definition of liberal democracy that says we seek out certain ideals, like, you know, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, or liberal, what is it? Equality and freedom, pursuit of happiness. These are kind of Lockean ideals, elevated slightly. And I think that's a pretty good place to start. And he says it's a beacon of hope for everybody.
Okay, so I think that the question that I always have at this point is, so it feels to me like those ideals are one step into second order principles.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, okay, so we decide to believe in equality, or we decide to whatever. And I mean, it's compelling, but I think that basically what I would say is that there was probably a period where our social contract had a certain level of consensus around some of those things. And so then you wouldn't have to talk about things a couple steps down. I just think that the level of friction now is a couple of steps down. And you do have it from the contingents on the new right that you're describing, like that are pushing for these nationalist and more racially defined
what
categories.
Are the frictions?
But I think you
what are the friction when you say the frictions? What are you talking about, Sam?
Yeah. So I mean, what I would say, So what I would say is, I think there's a real tension around, what are humans and why should we value them, and that hits in some of the circles you're talking about, but it also shows up in like what we were talking about earlier, like the tech right. So if you think about the like effective accelerationist crowd, like Peter Thiel or Mark Andreessen, I'm not sure that they're not like, there's like a movement like full on successionism that wants like AI to like whatever, kill the humans and take over the planet or something, or like, who cares if that happens? I'm not sure they have that view, but I do think they have a little bit of indifference. It's like there are 400 smart people in the world who all are doing what we're doing, and what happens to the rest of people doesn't really much matter. And my view is maybe there was, okay, here's how I would put the argument. Liberalism seems to me to be a post-trauma political movement. So it happened in a post-traumatic period in the 18th century after like 2 centuries of significant war. I think about a third of the German population was killed in the wars of religion in various, and like huge death tolls in other European powers. And so part of what happens is you just say, okay, we need a structure that makes it so that doesn't happen. And you see this already in Hobbes in the middle of the 17th century. And then it's that sort of like the passion that powers that is, whoa, war is terrible and we don't want to keep doing that. And then I think you see it in the uptick of liberalism in the 20th century also, that it's a post-trauma politics. You have 2 like totally devastating, catastrophic, worldwide conflicts that are strong enough to say, okay, we need to not be involved in that specific version of violence again. And then maybe the fact that you have nuclear weapons developing on that basis also is really important and valuable. That says, okay, like, first of all, like, if we do this again, it's going to be so catastrophic that like no one is going to be alive. And so we just need to have a structure in place that does have this, like, at least illusion of having solved the key political problems, so that we just don't get into these kinds of tensions again. I just think like all of that has ended up having a shorter half-life than the people who said that they could pull that off wanted it to. And so now we are having, if you compare like the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that period, that's a universal declaration, right? I just think like the founding impulses or intuitions or metaphysical desires that made it so that generation could do that are not self-renewing for us. And so if you're going to have a political response or coalition that's able to do that effectively, it has to be interacting with, what are humans? Why do they matter? What are we actually talking about when we say universality or dignity or justice? Like, none of those words, I think, have like an adequate response in any of the kind of left politics that I'm seeing.
I mean, I really like the term, or how you describe liberalism, as sort of a post-traumatic politics. I think that's exactly right. And if you think about sort of trauma and wounds, right, in this sense, like, liberalism is sort of the Band-Aid that was put on the hemorrhaging to just like, let's just like stop the fighting. We'll just agree to this for now so that we can, not need to talk about all those things that we were talking about before that were tearing us apart in a fleshly way. But yeah, Band-Aids only stay on for so long. And at a certain point, like, the flesh underneath it, those metaphysical understandings of like, what is a person? What is a nation? Is a nation a thing? Is it important? Does ethnicity matter? Like, how do we value things? Like, those questions have to be re-answered. And they're also like really compelling questions. And I feel like one of the things that the new right has done, and that I think made it like sort of makes it attractive and interesting and compelling in this moment, is that they're just providing answers to those. Like, they have a clear answer for like, who counts in a society, which humans do we respect, what is a state, what are our values? They at least just say something. I mean, most people might not agree with them, but, and I say this often, if you're giving someone, if someone is like looking for a map or looking for understanding, like, if you offer them something, they'll take that. If the opposing vision is like nothing, even if it's not the right thing, they'd rather have something in hand to clutch onto than to still be like wondering, like, under liberalism, like, what's going on? Like, the strong God is attractive. But I mean, your book points out, and this moment points out, that that new right vision, the answers that have been provided are also kind of ugly. May not be the right ones, or might be.
But Christine, let me jump in there quickly. So let me jump in there quickly, Christine, because there's a version of this where it's like you do that at the normative level, where you're like, oh, this is ugly, and like there's a moral case against it, which seems viable. I actually, right now, I'm more intrigued by the more practical or political thing, which is, I'm not wildly convinced that this is like gonna work for 50 years. Like, you can like keep this like specific kind of vaguely like right post-revolutionary mood going for a decade or something. That's interesting. They're like able to run that.
Yeah.
But eventually, like like, just think about the difference between the tech people and the RFK people. Like, Elon is like, I want to put microchips in your brain to project Coca-Cola ads in perpetually, and then RFK is like,
measles are cool. We're bringing that back.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we are not even putting needles in, like, nothing. And so, like, that's like a real intellectual tension right now. It's held together because Trump is strong enough to be able to keep those, like, everyone thinks that the interests go in the same direction, but that's not like obviously like going to be a long-term sustainable family harmonious relationship. So I think the question that, like, my bigger issue is like, much more on the other side, which I just don't see other factions that are like vital, alive, imaginative, like asking like large, like, you know, in Fukuyama's terms, like thematic questions about,
Yeah.
wait, why are we all unhappy? How does this work? Like, what's longing for? What's like, how do you have
Yeah.
blood in life? And like, you know, if those factions have something to say and are able to argue it with force, I think there are absolutely going to be opportunities to be able to do that. It's just that right now, I mean, like, you know, like I'm, you know, good friends with Derek Thompson, who has the Abundance book from last year or from this year. And, I like that. I think it's an interesting book. Also, like, you know, he and I have argued for 3 years about how like he should have put in a chapter about the meaning of life.
Yeah,
Because
right.
like right now it's just like, I don't know, you should build houses. And you're like, okay, that sounds great, but like why?
Yeah.
Like what is
Yeah.
it about houses? Like how does that
Yeah,
relate to the
yeah.
purpose of things? And I think like that's the like I want politics to be like in some ways like I wonder if I've read this book slightly the opposite way to a lot of your audience, which is I read it and I'm like, there's a lot of this register of talking about large existential questions that like impinge on the nature of life. That's what I want in politics, actually. Like, I'm not sure at all that these people are coming up with the answers that I want to go along with. But the idea that that's a conversation that's worth having, like that does feel alive to me and has fire to it.
Yeah. So I guess
I mean,
the
I think
question,
that you're speaking my language, Sam. And I think a lot of people on the left, or especially in the center, are like, oh, no, we need way less of this, way less politics, way less confrontation, way less. We got to lower the stakes, right? We got to lower the temperature. And I understand that. And I think it's a very kind of fussy, complicated. I'm very liberal about this. Like, I think it's complicated, right? But I'm on the other side of it. Like, I want more confrontation, more engagement on this level. I think that's how I got into. I mean, maybe it's my book skews towards the existential because that's what I find interesting. But I think those conversations are real. Liberalism, I mean, I would say a couple other things in response to what you guys have just laid out. I like the post-traumatic, you know, this is a post-traumatic philosophy, but I think it has always been that. It's always kind of been, what is it, defensive crouch liberalism, Cold War liberalism. But I think that a real problem here is that liberalism has always had a potential to be much more than that, to be constructive, to be concerned with human flourishing. It's just that I think one of the major things about it, I would trace its origins to early modernity, is that it's going to be plural, and so it has to find a way to talk about this problem of moral pluralism and dynamism, and still also think about how to cultivate community, how to build structures, how to educate people in a kind of combative, not morally relativist, but morally pluralistic situation that allows people to kind of cultivate truly opposing modes of life, right? That are in real disagreement and still sort of supports that in a thick way. So I think it's very difficult on sort of a political plane to speak about this problem, and then let alone to kind of do something about it in our public discourse. And so, but I agree, like there's just something. And I guess one other thing I'll say is I think that we've kind of, as liberals, or liberalism has been, or this is a critique the right would have, that it's just been sort of living off the fumes of the old religions, right?
Yeah.
This is a kind of Patrick Deneen thought. And so the more, to whatever extent there is a kind of moral orientation within liberalism, it's just borrowing from prior traditions. And I think there's some truth to that. So liberalism has to become more deliberate about its moral education, about its civic education, in this pluralist mode that I'm hoping to sort of peddle. But it has to allow those older traditions to flourish, and in a serious way, right? And to be explored, right? But it has to. But so I think that liberalism has always had space for that. It's just been very sort of asleep at the wheel, again and again, at actually taking on the problem and doing anything about it, you know. And I don't know what that is. Like I'm constantly watching the Democrats, and just like Obama was pretty good at least talking about some of these
I think that's
things.
true, actually.
Yeah.
And it certainly as a rhetorician.
Yeah.
And I think he was hemmed in so much by the ferocious response to him on the right. I mean, people used to say, people attack Obama for having this utilitarian understanding of higher education, right? Or like that he's all careerist and only cares about STEM. And I don't think that was true. I think when he started to speak about the humanities in a sort of richer register, people just attacked him for being a sophisticated elite. I mean, he couldn't win. And so I don't know how. I mean, do you have? I'd love to hear if you guys have more idea. AEI does a lot of work, right, about higher education, But I don't see liberal think tanks doing much of that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm at AEI now, and it's interesting that I joined AEI in part because there's a social, cultural, and constitutional studies sector, and I don't really do the constitutional studies, but the fact that there's an interest in social and cultural understanding, I was like, oh,
Yeah.
someone's thinking about these deeper questions as opposed to just the technocratic questions or just producing sort of economic
Yeah.
position papers. But yeah, I mean, I don't have an answer to that, and I guess as we're drawing our conversation to a bit of a close here, I think I have to turn the question back to you, because this is the real thing that I wondered about as the book closed, and in this particular Fuentes Tucker like lame duck entering moment. You know, you gave us a taxonomy of a bestiary, a catalog of wonders of the new right. And in this particular moment, we can kind of see them beginning to, or maybe we're past beginning, to tear themselves apart, to fall apart. As Sam points out, it's not a stable coalition at this point, and especially after Trump leaves. I don't know that J.D. Vance is the force of personality that's going to hold this whole thing together. So where do you see this evolving? I mean, the right, where do you see that evolving? But also, like, what is there any energy on the left that you see at all that could bring something of the, I don't know, emotional and political force that the right surprisingly has brought for the past 10 years? Where is this? What's next? Or maybe we're all just going to be taken over by our tech overlords and we won't have to think about this, which I think is what Sam maybe thinks.
Robots can think for us. It's awesome. Just one way of sharpening that quickly. So, you mentioned earlier that a lot of the Straussian tradition has ended up on the right. Is there a contingent on the left? And if so, is it one that you feel like is promising as a source of rejuvenation?
Okay. Well, I think I don't think for one thing, I don't think it'll be the tech overlords. I don't think the American public, I mean, there's a lot that sort of goes, that's just sort of latent in the air of America, right? And I don't think the American public is really a fan of what's going on with the tech right. Okay, so let me just put that on the table. I think that that's not going to be a fast eventuality. And I don't think that the tech guys, with the exception of maybe Thiel and Andreessen and Musk, are like ideologues in the way that the people I write about are. I mean, I write about a couple of them, and Yarvin, right? But so I think that they're very. A lot of this is, but I don't know. You might know better than I do. But I think that there's a kind of pragmatism on the right that I don't know that they'll be able to ride out all of these tensions. But the piece I do want to recommend is this Patrick Deneen piece in Unheard, where he basically says J.D. Vance is the perfect avatar for both the tech right and post-liberal Catholicism. So they're quite happy sort of making convenient, as we've seen, right, for the last 10 years, they're pretty happy to make these pragmatic compromises. But again, I think it's very fluid. One of the things that I'm hopeful about because of this, like a lot of our politics I'm very troubled by, I'm horrified by. I mean, I'm sure you all know people who have been fired or maybe taken by ICE, and
Yeah.
right. And I've had that experience, and it's awful. And so I find that there's something really dehumanizing about what we're living through. And the thing that worries me is sort of the kind of corruption of our political culture and our norms and values. So that there's been no good in that. But on the other hand, there is this dynamism, and Trump has shown us that a lot of things are possible in politics that we might not have known about. A lot of questions are worth asking that we haven't been asking and need to be asking. And there is this kind of thirst for something, not just among the young men, right, of the new right or who are reading Jordan Peterson. I mean, I think that it's not just them who are asking these questions and who are intrigued by it. And so, you know, whether the left has anything to say, I think is TBD. I'm hopeful. I think our political culture does. Hollywood probably does, right? And so we don't need to put all our faith in the technocrats or I mean the abundance guys. They have something to say. At least they're trying. But I hope we can do better. I hope to be part of something better. But it's like it's very disorienting because you're like, okay, who wants to do this? And it's like
anyone.
It's hard. Yeah. But I think people are are hungry for it. So, but I'm a bit optimistic, Sam, by nature, and I don't know about you, Christine, where you think this is headed, but that's my 2 cents.
I mean, Christine, you do write on, like you've written a lot of things about unhappy people, about sex, and
It's
unhappy
true.
people about gender. But when you're thinking about like sources where you see like happy people, or like possible sources of like rejuvenation, vitality, inspiration, do you have any, like just a couple that?
Yeah, I like this idea of ending on a hopeful note. I totally agree,
We'll try,
Laura.
yeah,
With
Demir's not here.
Yeah, Demir's not here, so we can be happy. um, I also sense this hunger. In talking about people looking for a map or searching for somewhere to go. Like, people are tired of this, of feeling like they don't have an impact, or feeling that sort of the movements that do have an impact are these kind of terrifying and exclusionary ones. And I think I'm just not sure. Like, I see people hungry, and I see people wanting to interact sort of in their real lives and have like real communities in sort of individually, not individually as a community, but on sort of the grassroots level. And I'm not sure yet who is translating that into kind of a larger theory of like
Mhm.
what a good life is that could be promoted on a political scale. I mean, I see people attracted to candidates like Mamdani, um, because, in fact, he did have that sort of like optimistic outlook. Um, but like, is there a clear sort of theoretical set underneath it? Is there a clear metaphysics underneath it? Like, who is putting that together? I'm not sure that anyone is yet. And there will have to be a
Mhm.
core for whatever new
Mhm.
movement there is to continue to be dynamic and sustain itself.
Mhm.
Sam,
Yep,
we'll give
agree
you
about
the
that.
last word
That's
as we round up. What do you
Oh,
think?
I hope not. Sources of rejuvenation. I mean, this is like basically what I think I write a lot about for Wisdom Crowds. Like, my own intuition here goes to the idea that you just have to confront the tension between the finite and the infinite to have any viable approach to this. So the constant dialectic with Demir, unhappy Demir, as we were saying, is that he tends to think about politics, I think, just very much at coordinating arguments at the finite level well. And I just tend to think like everything that's spilling out in our politics is saying humans need infinity, or some sort of like large, like a vision that's larger than the world. And I take that not just as a like practical point, but as like a metaphysical point, which is, oh, humans need that. But also, like, my view is that there's at least like an inference that you could draw from that to the idea that the world is big enough for that longing. I don't think that that's a necessary, like, it's not a deductive step, but it's at least like a question that comes
Mhm.
from the level of conflict and difficulty. And so that's why I think, for me, like, this is a time when we need like poetry and philosophy and metaphysics and like these kinds of religious visions about the nature of the world that are heavy enough to say,
Yeah.
like, there's something real and you should give your life to it. I like, basically what I think about the Jordan Peterson stuff is that, like, no one's saying like there's something large enough that you could sacrifice for. And I
Yeah.
think that's what's attracted people to effective altruism. It's what's attracted people to a lot of these kinds of like new Stoic practices. It's
Yeah.
like the world is heavy enough and there's something that and I think it's what's attracting people to the like movements on the right
To the
about like having
manosphere,
children, getting married, like all these kinds of things. Right.
No,
Exactly.
I am completely.
Yeah.
I mean, that's why I ended the book on the humanities and sort of a liberal renaissance, by which I don't mean liberalism. I mean like liberal arts and the humanities, because I think not just the Western canon, but like comparative literature, there are resources for human beings to enrich your life. And like, I don't know that all of us need to be engaged in the transcendental infinities, but I hope that all young people, that everybody gets to at least dabble in that, right, as a young person. And I think that's where it's like Alex Lefebvre writes about it in his, you've talked with
We
him, right,
interviewed
Sam?
him,
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, we've had him on the podcast.
Oh, you
yeah.
okay, right. So I mean, he's got this idea that liberals don't really care about metaphysics, and I think I'm not enough of a liberal to agree with that, or he's wrong, right? I think that liberals can and should and often do care about metaphysics, and what it means to devote yourself to something, possibly sacrifice yourself to something. So, I mean, all of this, I think it should be available to almost anybody who wants it. It should be available to. I'm very hesitant to think that everybody needs to go do political philosophy, or even in college. Like, I think that there should be this, but this must be available. There must be programs available at every big public institution where you can go, read these texts, including the biblical texts, right? And have these deep, enriching experiences, because that's at least a starting point, not just for kind of common conversations, but also for finding answers about what to do about AI. I mean, you cannot, we are
Yeah.
completely, I think, flat-footed right now. And so I'm completely in agreement. I think I'd quibble probably, Sam, with some of just the ways in which you think about this, because I have probably a different metaphysical outlook. But yes.
Great. Love that.
Yeah.
This has been so fun. Laura, thank you so much. And
Yes.
This is a great
Yeah.
note to end on. Yeah. Thank you for joining us.
This is so fun to talk with both of you.